Hello, everyone, and thank you for this for joining this ASMR, open source ASMR session. Sorry. So welcome to this talk about $1 billion for open source maintainers in particular. And just a quick thing that I want to say is it's not only $1 billion, it's $1 billion per year, right? And that sounds like a crazy large amount. And the point of this talk is going to be to show you that it is not. And so, before we get into it, I have just want to give some background on myself. So who am I? Well, my name is Toby Langell. I'm a jazz drummer turned open source developer turned consultant. And I run a small consulting firm called Unlock Open. And I've been into sustainability and supply chain security for a very long time. I've been talking about this before it was essentially cool. God, this whole thing is a very strange experiment. I believe that in order to address the sustainability problem that we have with open source, we need a huge mindset shift. And so today, to sort of move you on this transition, this mindset shift transition, I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to talk about money, because we never talk enough about money, especially in Europe. This is something that we find difficult to talk about. I'm going to make the case that maintenance and innovation are not the same thing, and that treating them separately is going to be very helpful and important. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about why we should professionalize maintenance like we have done many other things around open source. What I'm not going to do, although I'm happy to take questions on this, but it's not part of the presentation, is talk about who's going to provide $1 billion per year for open source, for the maintenance of open source. And also, I do want to make the point, because this is something that comes up on a regular basis, that every project is different, right? And what might work for a project or a given community or a given language might not work for another. And so don't feel threatened by this model, or if this model doesn't work for your project or for your community, that's entirely fine. And I also, really believe that the breadth and depth of the problem are so big that we're going to need many different solutions. So there's no silver bullet. And all of these different efforts are ands. They're not competing against one another. All right. So let's get started talking about money. So as I was saying, $1 billion per year sounds like a crazy big amount. And the question is really, is it? And so I'm offering that we collectively do the math here. I don't even know if that's going to work. Do you know how many developers there are in the world? So I know that you can't really answer me right now. So there are different ways to calculate this, right? Different data points. Roughly, data points go from about 10 million to about 30 million, depending on what you count. I went with that number. That comes from a 2022 IDC survey, and it says 16 million professional developers worldwide. Again, question, what do you imagine the average dev salary is in the world? Well, lots of different answers here also. Depends on how you count. And I went with this figure, right, which is not loaded salary. So this is actually the paycheck that people bring home. And it's roughly between 60K and 80K if you average worldwide. Also depends how you average. And it's really important, worth noting that loaded salaries are actually can be up to twice that. And by loaded, I mean once you pay taxes, Social Security, an office, a training, a computer, et cetera, et cetera. So if you multiply the number of professional developers in the world by their average salaries, you get this astoundingly high number of money that is spent on building software per year, right? And roughly, it's $1 trillion. So every year, we spend $1 trillion on essentially paying the salaries of people who build software. And if we look at 0.1% of $1 trillion, which you'll agree with me is a very tiny number, well, 0.1% of $1 trillion is $1 billion, right? So the $1 billion figure is really here to both, as we'll go through, demonstrate how valuable $1 billion is, and also show how small it is compared to what we're collectively spending on software, on building software anyway. That's a visual representation of $1 trillion, where every single one of those aggressively purple squares represent $1 billion, right? So there are 1,000 $1 billion purple squares here. This, there, is $1 billion for open source maintainers. As you can see, it's not a lot. If you look at different data points around how much open source is used and how much of open source represents, how much open source you find in software and applications, you get a whole bunch of different numbers. Roughly, this is the Synopsys one. It's been consistently around 3/4 for close to a decade at this point. It used to be Black Duck. So 76% of code is open source. That's the 2023 numbers. So if you compare those two things, it's kind of wild, right? Like, I mean, this is, on your left, you have the amount of software, of open source software in regular applications. And on my right, yeah, I mean, on the other side, you have the amount of money that we feel is this insanely big number to ask for to maintain essentially like what's on the left, right? So the perspective that we have is completely flawed, and that's like the first mindset shift that I really want you to make, is to think about this differently and go out of this room thinking, well, it turns out that actually 1 billion isn't that much. Okay, second part of this 3-chapter presentation is about maintenance. So whenever I talk about money in open source, I hear people say, and rightfully so, and I've been of the same mind for a very long time, well, money is going to kill open source, right? If you bring money into open source, it kills open source. And this perspective has been shared by many people. Here's one, for a long time, right? Here's a 2013 comment on the topic by DHH, the founder of Rails, essentially saying that, what's valuable, one of the key things that's valuable in open source is the fact that people come to open source not to sell you something, not to build a product that they will sell, but to scratch their own itch, to solve a problem that they have in a very lightweight way. And that, this lightweight aspect, this very focused aspect on solving a problem and not trying to build a product is actually what makes open source so good. So I'm entirely with you if you're concerned that bringing money into open source might have some really ill-advised effects. And it's unquestionable today. Like, we really have to acknowledge the fact that the open source way of building software is this incredible innovation engine, right? It powers literally 3/4 of the software stack that we're relying on for everything from banking to sending satellites into space. So, whatever we do, we want to be really careful not to entirely ruin this incredible innovation engine as we try to solve the maintenance and security aspects that are plaguing open source. And so this is a really strong case I'm going to make here, is like there's a really big difference between maintaining open source software and building, innovating in the open source software space, right? And the way open source maintenance looks today is kind of like this. A developer has a piece of software that they're maintaining, and they're really struggling to make ends meet. And they're burning out supporting this, and they get support from a company that shows up and says, we really like this software. It would be great if it also did X, right? Here's 10K to work on this new feature. And the outcome of this is not what you think it is at all, right? Like a lot of companies feel like when they're pledging money to open source projects to work on features, et cetera, they're supporting the maintenance of open source. They're not. They're focused on innovation, right? They're paying for innovation. They're not paying for maintenance. And the outcome, like ironically, is actually worse for the maintainer, because before that they had 14 features to maintain, and now they have 15. If you spot an XKCD reference in there about standards, like it's by design. I see one or two heads nodding. And I say, like, in the open source maintenance space, we suffer from featureitis, right? And this is a problem not only in open source, it's like pervasive across the whole tech industry, where really it's like the shiny object syndrome, right? We're really excited by what's new and innovative, and we don't care that much. It's really hard to sell supporting infrastructure. So in order to make the case of how innovation and software development, innovation, like the development aspect of open source and the maintenance aspect of open source are different conceptually, although they're often done by the same people, I think it's really valuable to talk about project lifecycle. Roughly speaking, kind of every open source project goes through something of a cycle of that nature, right? There's an initial development phase, then there's a growth phase. At some point, like so many people use the project that, this is for a successful project, right? So many people use a project that it matures, and essentially the benefit of innovation compared to the benefit of stability, the ratio changes, and there's so many users that just people want stable software at this point. And this gives room for others to innovate either on top of this existing software or elsewhere, progressively this software becomes more relevant or goes deeper in the stack, and either sort of like stays as something we all rely on, but is no longer seen as like this innovative, highly valuable piece of software, and becomes sort of like a pipe, or it gets sunset. Roughly speaking, the development phase, the innovation phase, is through initial development and growth, and then the maintenance is through growth and maturity and sunsetting, right? And I'm really going to try to make the case that these are two different things. What's interesting is when you start looking at a whole bunch of open source related things, you see this pattern, right? It's very common for projects to start the initial phase being driven by one person, or maybe like a very tight core of people. And it's very common from a governance perspective to have a BDFL model evolve to an open governance model as the project becomes more stable. If you're familiar with Wardley maps, right? This also really maps the way Simon Wardley talks about innovation, right? Going from genesis, so prototyping, like rapid innovation, to custom build solutions, to products, and then to a commodity. So essentially something that you no longer really see as a defining element of your stack, but something that's just valuable. I'm going to share the slides. By the way, I see a couple of folks taking pics. You're more than welcome to do that, but the slides are online, and they're openly licensed, so you can do pretty much what you want with them. So, in Wardley maps, you see this sort of model. Simon Wardley actually talks about this really interesting thing, which is there is no good way to build software. It depends sort of like the maturity, where it is on the life cycle, right? What works in the innovation phase, like agile, doesn't work when you have like very basic low-level software that everyone relies on, right? Of course, Six Sigma, for those who know what it is, feels very odd to bring into software. But imagine if something like SQLite was, rapidly evolving under your feet as you were just building an app on top of it. It would be, it wouldn't work at all, right? If you're familiar with the pioneer settlers, town planners metaphor, like also really fits. Like you have really different kinds of people that are interested in different parts of this life cycle. One aspect that to me is particularly meaningful, and I think to a lot of open source practitioners too, as you move into the in the life cycle from the early days of an open source project to its more mature times, you're really moving from when open source is a craft that like a few people are like literally they have their hands in it and they're building, to something that is a lot more akin to industrialization, where you have processes, structure, governance, defined groups of people working on specific aspects, et cetera. Hard skills, soft skills, right? The more a project grows, the more managing consensus, dealing with people problems becomes something that's important and relevant. Maker's schedule, manager's schedule, same thing, right? You really have this shift with the life cycle of a project that moves from people just focused on building stuff to people focused on people in meetings trying to organize the bigger system. And so, the point I'm trying to make with all of these examples is the open source way is really effective to do the first part, the first sort of like half of this life cycle, right? The part where you build things in the open and make it very exciting for others to join and come contribute and grow and create something that's valuable for a much bigger set of people. But we don't really have an equivalent of the open source way for the period of the life cycle that comes after this, when you have growth plateau and when you have maturity of a project and potentially sunset at some point. And so this is, this really brings me to the last part of this presentation, which is focused on professionalizing maintenance. Right? So the argument I'm making essentially is, in the life cycle of a project, you have this innovative open source way that drives the beginning of a project and mixes with what I believe at this point we need to do, which is professionalize maintenance. So this is how we think about open source today, right? We see open source essentially as entirely a volunteer-driven effort. And we have this unicorn in there, like the magical maintainer that is burning out, which is both a developer and the maintainer of software. And all of open source is not funded. This is how we think of it, right? The reality of what open source is today is actually a lot more like this, right? Which is that we have non-funded this mythical dev maintainer unicorn creature, right? And on the other hand, just look around you, right? All of these aspects of open source software, which are funded even for community projects, right? I'm not even talking about like single vendor projects here, right? But foundations like the Eclipse Foundation run events, right? They have a sales team. They do, they do policy. They do marketing, community management. They have a legal people. Might have a research team, support infrastructure, and increasingly even go into security, right? So we're actually funding a whole bunch of open source already. And like no one is going around saying, oh my God, like it's so horrible, it's going to kill open source at like events organized by people who are paid to do their job, right? And none of this has negatively impacted, or at least like directly negatively impacted the innovation engine that is open source. So my suggestion is simply, right, to think about this unicorn and split it into maintainer and developer. And look, you can entirely have two roles. Like it can be one individual that has two roles, right? But it's really useful to like, split them up and know what it is that you're doing. And the minute you operate that shift, what you can do is this, right? You can essentially increase, like move the goalpost of what is funded and what isn't, right? And sort of looping back to the first chapter of this presentation, the money part, right? It's when you think about it, $1 billion, which was this tiny amount of money compared to what we spend on software development, is enough to hire 10,000 maintainers. Like that is a lot of maintainers. So the question then becomes, okay, so like, let's say that we had this money, like what would it look like, right? What could we do? How could we actually support those? It turns out that one of the things that you need really quickly when you want to hire people to work on something is you need legal entities to do that. So it turns out that we have a bunch of different options, right? We have existing open source foundations. So there's legal complexity in hiring developers. Maintainers, it's slightly different, right? Because it's in support of the development work. So, here, again, making that distinction between the maintenance work and the development work might be an asset. We have fiscal hosts, right? We have funding platforms. We could even imagine new entities entirely focused on maintenance. It could be for-profit, or could not-for-profit, or even could be for-profit entities, right? Interestingly, baked into the Cyber Resilience Act, there is this notion of open source stewards, which have a bigger role and more responsibility than existing code hosting foundations have. And so my belief is, again, no silver bullet, like a combination of all of these will be helpful. That slide is in a strange order, but it's entirely fine. I'm going to run with it. Hopefully the other slides are after this one. This is what it would look like from a graph perspective, right? You can have private and public funding that would move to all of these different kinds of hosts, right? The FOSS foundations, fiscal hosts, these new maintainers, organizations, maintainer pods, if you will, that could hire people either directly, right, or through payroll companies. One of the things that COVID has enabled is a lot more flexibility and a lot more people working home. And with it came a lot of companies that are now, that can really help managing payrolls across state boundaries and across countries. And you can imagine that some of these maintainer pods would be focused on a single project. Some of them could be focused on multiple projects, many small projects. So you really have like lots of different ways that this could work out. Such a system, the organizations of those teams, of those maintainer pods, would be really valuable because it would help a number of things that we're missing, in my opinion, right now with maintenance, and which was part of the problem of and the burnout that we see, and the mental health issues that we see in the maintenance population. It's the fact that there's no teams, no support, right? And also like nowhere that you can build and you can work together and build dedicated practices, right? There's no sense of training for maintainers. Like maintainer is something that a successful open source developer has to figure out mostly on their own. There is no proper management and career path for maintainers at all, right? It's something that people are not even paid for it. Like, imagine having management and a career path, right? Another thing that you can imagine, from a team organization perspective is fractional. Okay, I'm hearing someone talk to me randomly in here. Sorry. So yeah, fractional maintenance is something that could be possible, right? You could, like in different communities, you look at JavaScript, you will see lots and lots and lots of super tiny projects. You can't have a maintainer for each one of those, right? You could imagine someone maintaining 20 of those related and relevant projects. So lots of different things you can think about. Some of the benefits that you would also have is the ability to share resources across projects. Right? Pretty much every open source project has the same kind of problems, and there's no sort of like best practice of how to do maintenance. There's no shared tooling. I mean, there is, but it's very much ad hoc. The focus of this maintenance would be really, really well scoped on security support and training, tooling and infrastructure, triaging bugs, release engineering, documentation, and compliance, right? So again, like you're really scoping maintenance to not be about the development and the innovation, but really be about maintenance. The same way people handling open source events are not also, as part of their event organizing roles, writing code. So what would be the benefits of this for maintainers? Well, I made the argument before that there was this slip from craftspersonship to industrialization, right? And I believe that a lot of people who are very much focused on open source and open source maintenance also really like the fact that they're working in small teams or in a small group of people, and was a work that is well aligned with their personal values and beliefs. I.e. they're not working in like very large tech organizations that don't necessarily fit what they believe would be their values, essentially. And so I believe that a lot of people also who are in our circles want work opportunities that are not necessarily all-consuming. And maintenance, professionalized maintenance could offer sort of like this midway position where if you care about software, you're not either starving open source maintainers or working for a very large tech company and might have a little bit of time to work on open source over weekends. In lots of countries, healthcare is something that only comes with proper employment. So, that's something that such a solution could really help enable. Proper management support. A lot of the burnout problems that we have in open source are similar to issues that you have in organizations where there is poor or an absence of management. Good support from management is something that I believe could also very much help with maintenance, to also frame maintenance and not make it so that maintainers feel like they have to fix a bug at 2 a.m. on a Saturday night. Separation between work and play, right? People who develop open source and maintain open source at the same time end up very doing both in like a very ad hoc fashion and without without intention on, hey, I'm going to be working on building this feature that I care about, and I have this bug that I have to fix, or I have this annoying issue that someone has brought up, and that person is being mean or problematic, and I have to deal with this. And I showed this XKCD example of like you have 14 features and someone pays you for a 15th one, right? So where you support maintenance through funding that is there for innovation. And this would be exactly the opposite, right? Like if you're working part-time as a maintainer, and this is your job, this gives you enough time to focus on open source if you want to, outside of the, your work. So it really separates these two things. And of course, you could imagine people who want to do maintenance full-time, right? And people who don't want to do maintenance at all, right? But it's just really splitting these two things and being intentional about them. Of course, the industry benefits are also important, right? I mean, right now, software supply chain security is a really big deal, and it's not gonna go as a problem, right? So having professionalized maintenance would be a tremendous boost to solving that problem. Similarly, compliance requirements, which are also going to be on the rise, having professional maintenance would really help. Also would be a lot better if when there was a problem with an open source software that was in your supply chain, you knew who to get to, right? And it was that person's job to actually make sure that that problem was going away, and not some sort of like weird request that you were trying to make to a volunteer that has, no reason to serve you. So I'm not suggesting that you would, end up in a client service provider relationship at all. But having like a point of contact that is clearly like, I'm the maintainer of this project and my responsibility is maintaining it would be very helpful. And alternatively, as a last point, I think what part of the industry is moving to as they have to secure their supply chain and start being more compliant with upcoming regulation is vendor solution, right? They pay a single company to essentially create sort of secured versions of the software that they use. And in the process of this, you're losing a lot of the benefits that come from open source, right? If whenever you want to use a new open source project as part of your day job, you have to go through sort of a standard software acquisition channel, make sure that it gets vendored in, that it's approved by a whole bunch of people. It's going to make everyone's life a lot harder, and we're going to collectively lose the benefits of this really frictionless way that we have that we can use open source. So, again, having money upstream to make sure that the software that you want to pick and use is properly maintained is going to actually benefit the industry. The really interesting aspect is, this all looks completely sort of like out of this world, right? But this model actually works. Like, we know it works. We've seen it work in very adjacent spaces. And one of the examples that I used to show this is Open Web Docs. So for those of you who are familiar with web development, the go-to place for information on how the web works is Mozilla Developer Network. I'm just slower than these guys, but we're going to get there, don't worry. So a Mozilla Developer Network is where you really find all of the information that you need to build websites and web apps. And it was owned and driven, well, it was a community effort, but really driven by a team at Mozilla. And at some point in the past, post-COVID, I think, there was, that team was let go. And a number of players, Mozilla included, banded together to collectively fund that team and created leveraged the existing open collective and a legal entity around it to essentially employ the whole team and have it supported through external donations. So, a very similar model that the one I was showing before, right? So you had private funding from Canva, Coil, Facebook, Google, Igalia, and Microsoft. Public funding that came later from the Sovereign Tech Fund, German Sovereign Tech Fund. And all of that went through a fiscal host, the Open Source Collective Foundation, a payroll company, Velocity Global, right? And everyone of the I don't know if it's everyone, but like the team essentially got hired through that payroll company, and have been employed and working on and maintaining and supporting this Open Web Docs project for 4 or 5 years at this point, right? So this model entirely works. And so yeah, to recap. The 3 key points I want to make is 1 billion is pocket change if you compare it to what we collectively spend on open source, on software engineering yearly. To really move forward with this, we have to split the innovation part of the open source way from the maintenance part and address those 2 things differently. And by doing that, we can shape a future for open source that is more secure, and more sustainable. Again, every project is different. So this whole thing might not be a good fit for your project, and that's entirely fine. And we don't really have a good solution to pay for this yet. However, with the requirements that are coming to software industry as it is getting regulated, we're clearly going to have to find solutions, because if software vendors become responsible for their whole supply chain, they will need to be able to rely on a supply chain that is secure and properly maintained and sustained. So I believe that we're at an inflection point where we can really make the case for this. Now is the right time to have these conversations and to figure this out. And if we figure it out, it's going to be, the sensible thing is going to be to fund an effort or efforts of that nature in order to make sure that the supply chain is secure and properly maintained and compliant to the legal requirements that are coming up. And I think, yeah, that's all I have for you today. So happy to take questions, and thank you very much for paying attention and nodding along. Thank you very much. So apparently you're going to get if you have a question, you can raise your hand, and someone will carry a microphone around, and everyone's going to hear the question, and then I can answer it. Oh, wow, you're stunned? Or did you not hear anything at all? And you're waiting for this to begin? God, it's so weird to make jokes and you can't hear anything. It's really bizarre.
Yeah.
Oh, great, a question.
Sure, thank you for the presentation. That's really good. My question is, how do you decide to maintain, because a project that has so many maintainers all doing really important work, how do you, as a project, when you get funding, how do you decide, depending on the funding you get, how do you decide who to pay? And, sometimes it's really hard to distribute the funds, so.
You all heard the question, right? I'm just checking. Okay, cool. So I think it's a really, this is a really interesting question. The question of how you disperse funds and what do you choose to fund, I would argue comes from a place where the kind of money that you get is ridiculously not enough at all. Right? So let's say that you have a project where you have 10 people that contribute to the project on a very regular basis, and most of their contribution is maintenance, right? And then you maybe get, I don't know, let's be very optimistic, you get 20K a year, right? And now you're what can I do? How is it fair for me to distribute those 20Ks? What I'm suggesting should happen if maintainers are professionalized is this is a completely different conversation. And you're not trying to figure out, oh, there are these people that are helping, let's give them a little money here and there to like, smooth things out a bit. You're thinking, okay, we're responsible for the maintenance of this project, and we have a budget that allows us to recruit 2 or 3 full-time people, or maybe 5 or 6 part-time people. Who is a good fit, like, and in a position to do that job and wants that job? And I think it's an entirely different conversation. So I'm kind of punting on the question, but I think it's part of the mindset shift. If you run a business and like if you're a single, open source vendor, and you have a lot of contributors to your project, and you want to, and you have a budget to recruit 2 or 3 people to accelerate innovation of that project, you're going to make a decision that based on what's good for you, right? And to some degree, I think the same would apply in a case like this, which is the decision is going to be about what makes sense for the project. And I'm not going to say that it's going to be like the right decision or work out well, or there's not going to be odd places where people sort of like take the money for themselves and do stupid things. Obviously, that's going to happen, right? But I think it's like it's a really different mindset. Follow-up question here. The microphone is coming. And we might have time for another one after this, depending on how much I ramble.
Appreciate
or how much you ramble. Who knows?
I'll keep it short. I appreciate the model. It's really nice to see this sort of thing being adopted with something like research software engineers, data stewards, fair fellows, that sort of thing. I'm wondering why it's not happening. What's standing in the way from maintainers getting into pause and essentially demanding they get paid? Is it just the kindness of open source maintainers? And ultimately, what happens if we don't start paying maintainers and everyone burns out?
I mean, there's a lot of industries in the world that function on people being motivated by extrinsic goals and going over and beyond and burning out in the process, right? Any kind of care industry, you see this a lot. You see this in education. So, I mean, this is, it's a common pattern when people really care about what they do and feel a sense of duty to maintain the software that they built, that this happens, right? They don't get paid or get incredibly poorly paid, and yet they're still there doing their best to support the situation against all odds. I think the opportunity that we have is that there is, like, software is creating enough value that we can avoid falling in an extreme version of a model like this. And, in the process also show other industries that you can have what is essentially care work. So there's care of software, of like a common good. It's care work to some degree, right? And you can properly support it and fund it. My concern if this doesn't happen is, for me, like, security and sustainability go hand in hand, right? And we're going to have a really, really brutal awakening in terms of security and the impact that that's going to have on the world. What that's going to lead, maybe like a loss of interest in adoption of open source, which seems very doubtful, right? I think that's what is probably more going to lead to a crisis where software as a whole is perceived as non-reliable, unsafe, et cetera. And we're sort of on a trend of that nature already, right? If you look at surveys, people trusted software more a decade ago than they do today, right? So we're on a downhill slope in terms of trust with software anyway. So that's kind of like, the outcomes for me are not going to be good for software in general if we don't solve for this. And I think I'm at time. Do I have a minute left? I'm confused about the timer that does weird things. Can I take a last question? Is there a last question? Hearing none, seeing none. Thank you very much for your time and your great questions. And I'm going to share the slides online. And you're welcome to reach out if you want to discuss this more, have thoughts, questions, or don't like the idea at all. That's also entirely fine. Thank you very much. Thank you.